Welcome to the Walden Watch, a Marine Invasive Species Podcast. I am your host, Reginald Walden. I am a senior at the University of New Haven, majoring in marine biology with a minor in communications. In this series, we're going to be talking about invasive species. What they are, how they spread, how they impact the environment and economy, ways they are being managed, and what you can do to stop their spread. In this episode, we're going to discuss Roman legions carrying rabbits, how big game fishing helped pave way for the invasion of lionfish in the Caribbean, and how Shakespeare somehow connects to all of this. This is Episode 1, Profile of an Invader. What makes a species invasive? We will be covering the history of biological invasions, the definition of an invasive species, the common traits of invasive species, and different hypotheses as to how a species becomes invasive. Before we discuss the nuances of invasive species, we must first establish a definition. An invasive species can be considered a species introduced to a habitat, usually outside of its current or historical range, which causes negative effects on the economy, environment, or human health. This is the definition I like to use, and one I established over my research. A simpler definition could be a species introduced to a new habitat, which causes an environmental problem in its introduced range. However, definitions can be very difficult in biology. The sheer diversity of life on Earth always finds ways to defy the boxes we try to classify them in. However, even with the difficulty of getting a specific definition of an invasive species, it is almost obvious what they are. So far, you might be thinking of some introduced species which cause damage to ecosystems you are familiar with. You may be thinking of introduced cats, rats, and mongooses, which followed sailors to remote islands, hunting entire species to extinction. Perhaps you might consider kudzu, the vine that ate the South, which consumed entire forests and buildings throughout the southern United States. Or maybe the lionfish, a voracious predator which is rapidly consuming baitfish and depopulating coral reefs throughout the Caribbean Sea. My first hands-on experience with invasive species was when I worked with my Boy Scout troop to remove invasive plants from nature trails in Great Cedars Conservation Area in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. My least favorite invasive plant was Asian bittersweet, Celastris orbiculatus. It is a woody vine which can quickly climb trees, and its heavy weight can eventually topple them. When you uproot a bittersweet, you must remove the plant's long, extensive root system, or else it will simply grow back. Their long roots are very close to the surface of the soil, and will often extend beyond the tree or fence they are growing on. It results in a scene which could have come out of a Looney Tunes short, with an exasperated scout crossing a trail, pulling up a root which is comically longer than anyone expects. The history of invasive species predates their study by millennia. Archaeological digs in Norfolk, England, and the writings of Marcus Terentius Varro show Roman legionnaires brought rabbits to Britannia from Spain for their fur and meat. There is also evidence the Romans introduced pheasants to Britain for their meat, although this is hotly debated. Normans later brought rabbits to conquered Ireland in the 12th century. While rabbits are an introduced species to the British Isles, they are not considered an invasive one. This is because they have a lot of predators, such as foxes, stoats, polecats, and hawks, that control their populations. A lot of their large populations have to do with human activity, such as farmers creating habitats better suited for them, increase in production of cereal crops that they can eat, and gamekeepers killing their predators in order to make grouse shooting estates. We'll be discussing how human activity increases the population of problematic species later in this episode. In 1859, a British colonist released rabbits into Australia for hunting and to, quote-unquote, create a sense of home. Rabbits spread rapidly throughout Australia and became a devastating pest, threatening native wildlife and destroying crops. While it took rabbits 700 years to spread throughout Great Britain, it took only 25 for them to spread throughout 2/3 of Australia. In the sea, marine organisms have been attaching themselves to the hulls of ships and riding in bilges for centuries before scientists understood what was going on. In the 19th century, European traders in North America used the common reed Phragmites australis as packing material, which helped European varieties of the plant spread throughout North America. We'll be discussing this saltmarsh species later in the episode. As naturalists like James Cook, Charles Darwin and George Wallace surveyed the creatures of what they saw as the far corners of the world, they began to understand more about the factors which led species to be found in different areas. Charles Darwin wrote about introduced species in his book On the Origin of Species. He theorized species which evolve in more competitive environments would be able to establish themselves better when they reach new ecosystems. This hypothesis is still debated to this day, and it will be, similar to Phragmites, discussed later in this episode. While Darwin discussed introduced species, he didn't use the word invasive species. The earliest use of the term invasive species I could find was dated to 1891 in the forestry journal The Indian Forester. It had this to say on Pinus excelsa. As the species can exist under different climatic conditions and is an invasive species, it has extended beyond its original biome. In the present day, introducing new species to environments they did not live historically is commonly understood to be a bad thing. However, in the 19th century, when Darwin was conducting his research, some Westerners thought it was good. European starlings were introduced to North America by Eugene Schieffelin, an eccentric Shakespeare enthusiast who wanted all the birds mentioned in William Shakespeare's plays to live in North America, because reasons. He introduced about 60 birds into Central Park in New York City, and from the small population they grew into the 125 million strong menace which damages crops, forces out native birds, spreads livestock diseases, and crashes passenger planes throughout North America today. European starlings were also introduced to South Africa by Cecil Rhodes, a British-born South African politician and businessman who founded the De Beers mining company. He introduced the starlings to South Africa in 1897, along with other species of European birds. He said it would improve the amenities of the Cape by diversifying the bird fauna. It's safe to say the amenities of the Cape of Good Hope were certainly not improved by the introduction of the European starlings. Some say he did so because he missed the song of European songbirds, but could not find a reliable historical source to confirm this. The fact the introduction of the European starling is considered a more benign part of his legacy certainly says a lot about the guy. Unlike the introduction of rabbits to the British Isles, which was done for economic reasons, the introduction of European starlings was a deliberate attempt to alter the environment, to make America and Africa more like Europe. Acclimatization societies with similar missions sprouted up in Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. They sought to introduce familiar animals to the New World, and return the favor by introducing exotic animals to the Old. The Maori spiritual leader Te Witi criticized the reckless introduction of new species, but acclimatization societies were widely accepted by British settlers, and the damage they could cause was not understood. The term invasive species would first be used in its modern context and popularized by Charles S. Elton in his 1958 book, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. Charles S. Elton is to invasive species what Rachel Carson is to pesticides, and The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants is his equivalent of Silent Spring. These books sounded the alarm of a previously ignored environmental problem. It is the first book on invasion biology, and remains the most cited one on the subject to this day. Invasive species received much more attention in the 1990s and 2000s, thanks to the work of scientists like James Carleton, who studied how they travel via ballast water. In 1999, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 13112, which was designed to limit the spread and mitigate the impact of invasive species. The order defines an invasive species as an alien species whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, one of the world's leading conservation non-governmental organizations, defines an invasive species as a species that is established outside of its natural past or present distribution, whose introduction and/or spread threaten biological diversity. The IUCN is careful to differentiate it from an alien species, which they define as a species introduced by humans, either intentionally or unintentionally, outside of its natural past or present distribution. This distinction is important because not all alien species are invasive species. Many alien species end up having a positive impact on the environment, and even more perish before they can even settle. Whether an alien species is invasive or not can trigger intense debate, especially when it involves game animals such as largemouth bass, Roosevelt elk, or ring-necked pheasants. While the first two are obviously invasive species, their introduction is still celebrated by hunters and anglers who enjoy them. It is important to remember an invasive species requires damage to the environment or economy to be considered an invasive species. Harmless alien species are simply not invasive. However, this doesn't mean you should be automatically, quote-unquote, welcoming towards new alien species. It is very hard to tell if a species is going to cause damage before it is introduced, but considering the catastrophic loss which can happen as a result of a biological invasion, it is important to err on the safe side. The debate over whether specific species are alien or invasive raises another interesting question. Can a native species be considered invasive? Disturbances caused by humans, such as overharvesting, shifts in habitat, and nutrient pollution, can overly favor certain species, to the point where they pose environmental problems. Some definitions of invasive species, including the one I opened the podcast with, include these species. Hunters and fishermen often target large predators, which removes pressure on their prey. This can make native prey breed out of control and harm the environment. This is often seen in terrestrial ecosystems, where herbivores overgraze and degrade the environment when wolves, bears, and other carnivores are extirpated. In the ocean, overfishing of sharks led to an explosion in cow-nosed ray populations. These rays annihilated ecologically and commercially important shellfish beds. This loss of filter-feeding shellfish led to a subsequent decline in water quality. Sea otters have historically been overhunted to near extinction for their luxurious coats. Geopolitical competition over sea otter hunting grounds in the North Pacific led to the expansion of the Russian Empire in the region, establishing the borders the Russo-Japanese War would be fought over. The extirpation of sea otters from much of the North Pacific removed pressure on their prey, sea urchins. Sea urchins are grazers which eat giant kelp. Giant kelp form kelp forests, to provide habitat for a wide variety of fish and marine invertebrates, similar to the canopies of forests on land. Without the sea otters to hold back the urchins, urchins devoured the giant kelp, destroying this important habitat. As sea otters recovered in the 20th century, the majestic kelp forests recovered with them. Native species can also behave invasively when in the presence of excessive nutrients. Human inputs such as agriculture, burning of fossil fuels, and dumping of untreated sewage contributes to an imbalance of nutrients in water bodies. Excess nutrients lead to eutrophication, when nutrients lead to blooms of algae or aquatic plants. Algae blooms are bad enough on their own. They can kill seagrass and corals by smothering them, and upon decomposition, they form areas of diminished or completely depleted oxygen. It gets even worse when the blooms are toxic, and they can lead to large die-offs of fish, birds, and marine mammals. These are particularly troublesome around Florida, where toxic microalgae such as Carenia brevis form dangerous red tides. In 2018, red tides led to tragic deaths of over 100 endangered manatees and a whale shark. Carenia brevis is also toxic enough to make people sick if they breathe the air near a bloom. These blooms became an important campaign issue in the 2018 Florida gubernatorial election. Carenia brevis, however, is native to Florida and became a problem because of the excessive dumping of nutrients into Florida's waters from sugar production. When determining which species are harmful invaders and which ones are simply visiting aliens, it is important to assess the common traits of invasive species. While invasive species come in as wide and varied shapes and sizes as life itself, they tend to have a few common features which help them in colonizing new habitats. Obviously, not all invasive species share these characteristics. Marine invasive species are the main focus of this podcast, even if my introductory tangents have suggested otherwise. Many marine animals and algae have planktonic life stages, which means they do not have enough strength to swim against the current. Many invertebrates and fish use broadcast spawning to spread their eggs. In this form of reproduction, the female releases numerous eggs which are fertilized by sperm, or milt, in fish from the males. Huge volumes of eggs and sperm are produced by these species because it is very unlikely for the eggs to develop into mature adults or even be fertilized. Sometimes, there can be so much milt and eggs in the water that it can look white and appear as if there's sea foam in the area during a fish spawning event. I hope you're not eating. For some fish, such as salmon or lampreys, these eggs are buried in a nest. For others, they are released directly into the water column. In the water column, they float around until they hatch into microscopic planktonic larvae. Some larvae develop into planktonic animals, where they will float in the water for the rest of their lives and try to steal the Krabby Patty formula. Others gain the strength to swim against the current and become swimming or nectonic animals like shrimp, squid, or fish. Benthic invertebrates, including lobsters, crabs, and snails, float to the sediment and become juveniles. Sessile invertebrates like barnacles and oysters drift among the currents until they find suitable sediment to settle on. This is very important for sessile animals because they obviously cannot move to access new habitats and spread to new areas. This form of reproduction and larval development gives marine invasive species more opportunities to settle in new habitat, and also lets them spread through ballast water and ships, which will be discussed in more detail in Episode 2, which covers how invasive species spread. This reproductive strategy is effective because it allows organisms to spread by wind, currents, and tides. It is also effective because it can happen very quickly. While a pregnant shark can take months to give birth to a single litter, and an orca whale can have a gestation period of over a year, a single salmon can produce thousands of eggs. While slow reproduction with a high chance of producing mature offspring is an effective strategy for a stable environment, rapid reproduction with a low chance of producing mature offspring is effective for taking advantage of a disturbance. In habitats like coral reefs and rocky shores, where the ability to rapidly settle space means life or death, being able to reproduce quickly gives invasive species an edge over native ones. Asexual reproduction is also very useful for facilitating a biological invasion. Sexual reproduction is when two organisms combine genetic information into a unique offspring. It's the basic birds and the bees. It is the mode of reproduction of barnacles, fish, and all known mammals. It leads to the genetic variation which gives us such a tremendous variety of life on Earth. Asexual reproduction, with an A in front, is when one organism produces genetically identical offspring. While asexual reproduction is commonly associated with dividing amoebas or bacteria, it is also found in marine plants, algae, and simpler invertebrates like coral. It can give them an edge over natives, and helps facilitate biological invasions because only one organism is required to colonize a new habitat. For example, the seagrass Halophila stipulacea was able to rapidly spread from the Red Sea to the Caribbean Sea by asexual reproduction, displacing native seagrasses. This also happens in coral reefs off the coast of Brazil. Here, sun corals of the genus Tubastrea use asexual reproduction to rapidly overgrow rare coral species unique to Brazil. One of the most infamous examples of asexual reproduction among an invasive species is Caulerpa taxifolia, popularly referred to as killer algae. Normal Caulerpa taxifolia, which is found naturally throughout tropical seas, can reproduce both sexually and asexually. However, the invasive strain, which is found in cold water areas in the Mediterranean Sea, southern Australia, and California, can only reproduce asexually. And like a blob monster, a single piece of algae which falls off of a Caulerpa taxifolia plant can form an entirely new plant. This makes management of the species notoriously desperate and difficult. The valiant efforts to contain Caulerpa taxifolia will be discussed in Episode 5, which explores different ways invasive species are managed. Of course, this is assuming the new species can handle their new habitat in the first place. Most introduced species don't survive their initial introduction. The Gulf Stream naturally brings many animals from the Caribbean up to New England, but most of them quickly die from the cold once seasons change. The New England Aquarium of Boston, Massachusetts, contains a quote-unquote nursery of juvenile tropical fish, which drifted north during the summer and would have frozen to death if they remained in the wild. A particularly tragic case of this phenomena happened in 2018, when hundreds of cold-stunned sea turtles washed up on the shore of Cape Cod. Cold stunning happens when ectothermic reptiles, reliant on the outside environment for warmth, become stranded in cold habitats. Here, their organ systems shut down and they become immobilized. As of November 25, 2018, 244 sea turtles immobilized in Cape Cod eventually froze to death, but 340 were rescued by Mass Audubon and other organizations. The majority of the turtles were Kemp's Ridleys, the world's most endangered sea turtle. These sea turtles were stuck in Cape Cod because of confusion during migration. Climate change has been pushing turtles north, and when it came time for them to move on, they became confused by Cape Cod's geography, dooming over 200 sea turtles to an icy grave. Cold-stunned sea turtles have become more common in the past 4 decades, with over 1,250 cases in 2014. Dramatic shifts in temperature is an example of stress which influences the spread and range of species. Other examples of stress include salinity, amount of nutrients, and dissolved oxygen content. Invasive species, unlike sea turtles, tend to be broadly tolerant of stressors in the environment and capable of surviving in a wide variety of conditions. The study, Temperature Tolerance and Stress Proteins as Mechanisms of Invasive Species Success, examined 3 native and 6 invasive invertebrate species found off the coast of California. According to the researchers, among these species, invasives tend to inhabit locations with broader temperature ranges and higher maximum temperatures than native species. This is especially concerning in the context of climate change and ocean warming, which will give temperature-tolerant invasive species an edge over natives struggling to survive in a new, unfamiliar ocean. Of course, like many things in biology, there are always exceptions to what seems like a well-established rule. On land, some slow-reproducing ungulates like goats become devastating invasive species when introduced to new habitats. In estuarine environments like the Everglades, large, slow-reproducing Burmese pythons are eating their way through the food chain. Not every stress-tolerant, asexually reproducing species is going to become an invader right when it hits. In order to predict how biological invasions occur and determine how a species becomes invasive, scientists use invasion hypotheses. In science, a hypothesis is an idea or explanation which can be tested through study and experimentation. And in common usage, is used much more loosely and can refer to wild guesses or unsubstantiated theories, like your one friend who insists that dollar bills prove JFK was assassinated by aliens. Invasion hypotheses cannot explain every invasion. Ecosystems are very complex, and some hypotheses might be upheld in some experiments or cases, but not others. Most invasion hypotheses were originally written to describe terrestrial plants, which form the bulk of invasive species research. Land plants are very important to human landscaping, agriculture, and horticulture, giving them a lot of attention from public and private institutions. While doing research for this podcast, I found no shortage of resources on plants and comparatively little for algae and other marine organisms. However, even though they are mostly designed for plants, invasion hypotheses are still very applicable to marine ecosystems. One of the most common hypotheses used in both popular and scientific literature on invasive species is the enemy release hypothesis. In fact, some popular definitions of invasive species assume this to be the case, and you're probably thinking of it right now. It holds organisms become released from their enemies when they are introduced to new habitat. Their enemies could include competitors, parasites, pathogens, herbivores, and predators. Without these other organisms to keep their population in check, they can grow almost uninhibited. A similar concept is prey naivete, where native prey lack the adaptations to avoid an introduced predator. This concept will be discussed in Episode 3, where we explore the environmental impacts of invasive species. An example of the enemy release hypothesis in the marine world is the Asian shore crab, Hemigrapsis sanguinis. While Asian bittersweet became the nemesis of my middle school years, these crabs became the bane of my college career. When I worked as a park ranger for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at Cape Cod Canal, I led hikes to the rocky intertidal zone where almost every rock had multiple Asian shore crabs under it. Several dozen of these crabs were found for every native rock or Jonah crab, and they are now the dominant crab species of the New England rocky intertidal zone. When I took a class in aquaculture and had to maintain an aquarium of Asian shore crabs, I experienced constant frustration at their refusal to eat and tendency to escape their tank. One of the reasons this annoying species from Asia is able to be so successful on the coast of Europe and North America is because they don't have to contend with parasites that limit their populations on the coast of Asia. Whether the enemy release hypothesis applies to a biological invasion or not is largely connected to the environment of introduction. If the coasts of North America had similar parasites to the coast of East Asia, then I might not have to deal with so many of those annoying crabs. The enemy release hypothesis is sometimes combined with resource availability, in the rarely used resource enemy release hypothesis. In this hypothesis, a species initially succeeds because of release from its enemies before benefiting immensely from new resources. This is common in heavily populated tropical seas because they typically have very low nutrients. The famous clear waters of Hawaii, Caribbean Sea, and Mediterranean Sea happen because they have low sediment, low nutrients, and consequently low plankton. These low nutrients allow slow-growing corals to thrive and form some of the most magnificent ecosystems on Earth. More humans in these areas lead to more nutrients from agriculture, lawns, and sewage. More nutrients lead to growth of more rapidly growing algae, which overgrow and outcompete slow-growing corals. The naturalization hypothesis is one of the earliest invasion hypotheses. Originally developed by Charles Darwin in On the Origin of Species, Darwin argued that plant species within the same genus would be fiercer competitors because of their similar structure and adaptations. These plants, which are more adapted to competition, will be more effective in being naturalized to a new habitat. Scientists still argue over Darwin's naturalization hypothesis to this day. While Darwin's naturalization hypothesis relies on species from diverse origins being better at colonization of new habitats, the empty niche hypothesis depends on the diversity of the invaded habitat. In this hypothesis, an invasive species can take hold in new habitat by using resources natives are not exploiting. In ecology, the definition of a niche has changed over time. Joseph Janel coined the term niche in 1917, which he used to describe a species' habitat. In 1927, Charles Sutherland Elton defined it to mean a species' place in the ecosystem's food web. In 1958, George Evelyn Hutchinson described a niche as the space and resources accessible and used by an organism. The empty niche hypothesis best describes Hutchinson's definition. Under Hutchinson's definition, forever, the niche of an oak tree next to a salt marsh would be the nutrient-rich soil not inundated by salt water. The niche of the salt marsh plants would be in soil partially inundated by salt water. The niche of an osprey in the salt marsh would be the fish which live in the marsh and the trees or platforms it can rest on. If, for some reason, one of those organisms was not present in the salt marsh, then the ecosystem would be much more vulnerable to invasion. An example of the empty niche hypothesis applied to a plant is Centaurea solstitalis. This grass can dominate the annual grasslands of California because its deep roots can reach water in the soil which native grasses cannot. Ecosystems with more species or higher biodiversity are less vulnerable to invasion because they have less niches empty. They have less invasibility or potential to be invaded. If the grasslands of California were more biodiverse, then they might have had a species of grass which could reach deeper water, and therefore the niche would not be subject to be filled by an invader. It is no surprise the most diverse ecosystems on land and sea, tropical rainforests and coral reefs respectively, have a wide variety of niches. In tropical rainforests, different layers of the forest give a wide variety of species opportunities to exploit different plants and habitats. There are large foragers on the ground like tapirs, bromeliads which can grow in the tree branches, and even small crabs which live inside water collected by bromeliads. Coral reefs provide a complex 3D structure which supports sponges, corals, algae, and other sessile organisms constantly competing for space in a very slow, very long-term deathmatch. Fish and invertebrates compete over these resources and specialize in eating different foods, including herbivores which eat algae, piscivores which eat fish, corallivore, which I probably don't have to explain. Biodiverse ecosystems like these are less susceptible to invasion, but this does not mean they are safe. Coral reefs are still threatened by invasive species, and human activities such as overharvesting has already weakened their biodiversity. Sometimes, a niche is empty in an ecosystem because of natural causes. In other cases, human activity is clearly to blame. Overharvesting of plants and animals can create empty niches which invasive species can exploit. For example, the historic overfishing of groupers and sharks in the Caribbean Sea helped pave way for the infamous invasion of lionfish. One only has to look at historical photographs of trophy fish in a seafood restaurant to see the extent in which overfishing has damaged marine predator populations. What used to be a good day's catch 50 years ago would be unimaginable today. It's commonly reported in media that lionfish, native to the Indo-Pacific, have no predators in the Caribbean. That is partially correct. While most sharks and groupers find them unpalatable, there are some species of grouper which can eat them. When groupers were protected from fishermen in the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park in the Bahamas, the park saw a dramatic reduction in lionfish biomass while grouper biomass increased. If fishing had been better managed and more habitat protected, then the lionfish invasion might not have spread to the extent it is today. We will discuss how people are trying to stop the lionfish spread in the Caribbean in Episode 5, which covers the management of invasive species. Sometimes, however, species which replace an overhunted or overfished native can have environmental benefits. The green crab Carcinus manus is undoubtedly an invasive species in North America for its damage to commercially valuable shellfish and native ecosystems. However, it did have some environmental benefits in the salt marshes of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Decades of recreational fishing for finfish and blue crabs have removed pressures on the native herbivorous crab, Sassarma reticulatum, also known as the purple marsh crab. Without this pressure, the herbivorous crab overgrazed on salt marshes, heavily degrading the ecosystem. The green crabs forced the herbivores from their burrows, chased them away, and devoured them, restoring the balance to the salt marsh and allowing cordgrass to recover. Some non-invasive alien species have been introduced to areas where natives have been made locally or totally extinct. This is referred to as quote-unquote rewilding. Mauritius is famous for being the home of the extinct dodo, but it is also the site of another anthropogenic or human-caused extinction, the Mauritius tortoise. Dutch sailors harvested the tortoises for their meat, and invasive mammalian predators preyed upon their young. The Mauritius tortoise had an important role in the ecosystem of the island in grazing and dispersing seeds. The Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, working with the National Parks and Conservation Service, introduced Aldabra giant tortoises and Madagascar radiated tortoises to Mauritius so they can fulfill the same role. If you've been to a museum recently, you might be aware that humans have made some impacts on the environment. That was a serious understatement. Disturbances such as overfishing, habitat destruction, pollution, and eutrophication have forced entire species to extinction, spoiled culturally important sites, and are causing a global decline in biodiversity. However, some species can benefit from this. Unfortunately, they're also the invasive ones we hate. The disturbance hypothesis posits that these disturbances favor invasive species over natives, allowing invaders to thrive when they would otherwise be comparatively harmless. A clear example of this is the European varieties of Phragmites australis, or common reed, introduced from Europe to North America. You've probably seen them before on the shores of lakes, marshes, and even on the side of roads or the edge of parking lots. It's a tall grass which looks somewhat like hay towards the tip of its blade in the fall. Phragmites australis is an extremely stress-tolerant plant and is able to grow and survive almost anywhere. This allows them to thrive in disturbed environments like roadsides and harsh border habitats like salt marshes. In an intact, undisturbed salt marsh, Phragmites australis does not pose a problem, and the American variety, Phragmites americanus, was a part of the salt marsh ecosystem for centuries before the invasion. Normally, Phragmites australis remain towards the upper marsh, where the water is more brackish and are outcompeted by native grasses in the lower marsh. Unfortunately, human activity has created unnatural amounts of nitrogen in salt marshes and disturbed them, which allow Phragmites australis to grow out of control and displace native species which keep the salt marsh together. This is strong support for the disturbance hypothesis and an example of a normal alien species turning invasive because of human activity. Disturbance can come in the form of destroying old habitat, but it can also come in the form of new anthropogenic habitat and urban ecosystems on top of the old habitat. Urban ecosystems are very invasible, and the new structures give virtually every species in the area a new opportunity, which some are able to seize better than others. Many examples of iconic urban wildlife, including rock doves, brown rats, house sparrows, German cockroaches, and gray squirrels, have been introduced to new habitats throughout the world. These species are so ubiquitous in cities, many people don't even think about where they come from. This is also the case in the ocean, where construction of piers, docks, buoys, seawalls, offshore wind turbines, and oil platforms create habitat which invasive species thrive in. Man-made ecosystems can favor one species over another, creating problems like non-migratory Canada geese. Canada geese are normally highly migratory animals found throughout North America. In the summer, they can be found as far north as Alaska or Nunavut, and in the winter, they live throughout the southern United States and in central Mexico. In the 1960s, their populations have increased exponentially because of changes to the landscape. One of the only birds which can digest grass, Canada geese love to forage in lawns, sports fields, airfields, and parks created by suburbanization and urbanization. Wildlife managers and hunters also tried to promote non-migratory populations for more recreational opportunities. Without migration, they lead comparatively safer lives. They're able to produce more young. These resident geese crowd out wetlands for migratory geese and native waterfowl, decrease water quality with their droppings, destroy crops, and even cause airplane crashes. The disturbance hypothesis also shines light on an aspect of biological invasions, which is often ignored: their relation to other environmental problems. Invasive species are often presented in popular media independent of other environmental issues. While high-quality educational material from the National Geographic Society and National Wildlife Federation discuss the impacts of invasive species on the economy and environment, they do not discuss how they can relate to other issues like nutrient pollution, habitat destruction, or overfishing. It is important to discuss these issues in relation to each other because they are not isolated. Ecosystems are extremely complex, and impacts on one part can have catastrophic effects in the entire ecosystem. As we've seen in this episode with blue crabs in Cape Cod, groupers in the Caribbean, sharks off the coast of the U.S., and sea otters in California, a change to one species can alter the entire food web. Anthropogenic or human-caused disturbances to ecosystems in the past 300 years have been so great in extent and magnitude, some scientists argue Earth is entering a new geologic epoch. This unofficial geologic epoch is called the Anthropocene, after the Greek word for human. The Anthropocene is characterized by shifts in Earth's geology, hydrology, atmosphere, and biodiversity. Humans have embarked on intensive mining and construction, shifting tons of sediment around the world, sometimes in open-pit mines so large they defy imagination. Construction of dams and canals have bent rivers to human needs. The burning of fossil fuels released unprecedented amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, causing rapid changes to the temperature of the atmosphere, precipitation, and alkalinity of the oceans which threaten human civilization itself. Persistent synthetic chemicals like DDT, which did not exist in the past 100 years, have entered ecosystems and, given their non-biodegradable nature, will likely remain for an even longer period. These impacts unintentionally led to a widespread loss in global biodiversity. Humans have already driven some species, such as the Mauritius tortoise, Xerces blue butterfly, great auk, thylacine, stellar sea cow, and Caribbean monk seal, to extinction. Animals of great ecological, scientific, and cultural importance, such as the African elephant, tiger, and mountain gorilla, are close to vanishing from Earth entirely. For every charismatic animal which occupies our imaginations, countless more vanish, sometimes with virtually no recognition outside of the scientific community. Invasive species are a major contributor to this loss in biodiversity. They are the second highest cause of species endangerment on the IUCN Red List and the U.S. Endangered Species List. The highest is habitat destruction, which also exacerbates biological invasions. This makes invasive species a graver threat to biodiversity than overharvesting or chemical pollution. However, this should not be interpreted as a reason to de-emphasize these very crucial issues. Since the Anthropocene is unofficial, there is no agreed-upon start date. The original paper by Paul Crutzen puts a start date in the mid-18th century with the Industrial Revolution. Some scientists argue it goes back even further at the dawn of civilization. Regardless of when it began, it is still extremely recent in terms of geologic time. However, there is still widespread scientific consensus that we were involved in a quote-unquote sixth extinction, comparable to the mass extinctions at the end of the Permian and Cretaceous periods. Unlike previous mass extinctions, we can do something about this. We don't have to helplessly sit by as sturgeons, sharks, horseshoe crabs, crocodilians, and many other forms of life which survived multiple mass extinctions disappear into a vortex of concrete, caviar, trophies, and handbags. The looming challenges of the modern age are very difficult and complex. However, like many challenges before, they can be overcome. I hope through our journey together here on the Walden Watch, we will develop a greater understanding which will allow us to tackle them together. For our next episode, we will be discussing how invasive species spread throughout the globe, both intentionally and unintentionally. I hope to see you then. This is the Walden Watch, and remember, always stay vigilant.